Okay, so this week we will end with Impressionism. At this time in Paris, there were large salons that did. So this is the Salon des Refus. The Salon des Refus is just a fancy French name for all the paintings that got rejected. As you can see from this photograph that was printed in the newspaper, you can. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a pencil drawing that was illustrated for a journal. But you can see that there's just thousands and thousands of paintings that they're going through in the salon. And there's so many paintings that are being presented that 60% of the paintings that are presented are rejected. Eventually, artists make their own salon called the Salon de Refus. It's a salon of paintings that were rejected from the official Paris salon. So, we're going to switch gears here for a minute. We're going to talk about photography. And I guess it's not for a minute, it's going to lead us into realism. So, photography was a very anticipated technological breakthrough of the 19th century. And I know that you didn't take art history 2 with me, but in the Renaissance time, there was this machine, which is pictured here, called the camera obscura. And it was used by, high Renaissance artists, mostly in the North. They were able to take an image, a sketch, or something of that nature that they had drawn and shine it on a mirror and enlarge it. But the camera obscura wasn't something that the artist was able to permanently affix the image onto a piece of paper. The artist had to intervene. They had to actually draw the image out from the camera obscura. Now that photography has been invented, that image is then affixed to the paper, which means that the artist would prefer the camera over a machine that they had to go back in and render. But you can also see how that might make an artist feel somewhat unwanted or concerned about their career, that maybe all of a sudden artists aren't needed anymore. Like back in the day, before there was photography, if you wanted a portrait, you had to pay an artist to come paint a portrait of you. And so that's why we have so many high society portraits, right? They were expensive. So photography, the process of photography was bought by the French Academy of Sciences. They purchased the rights to the process from Daguerre on January 7th of 1939, and then they give away the formula to the world the following August. The daguerreotype spread throughout the world by the end of that year. Photography was not Daguerre's invention all by himself. It was more of a collaboration of efforts between several people, but we do credit him with the process. Daguerreotypes took on a form of still life. Daguerre was imitating the painter when he set up the image for photographing. But even before Daguerre was able to prove that his system worked without error in repeated tries, he really imitated the role of the painter. For example, the still life that he creates in the studio. The still life was a perfect subject for him because the daguerreotype had a very long exposure time. And the long exposure times in this new process made it very difficult to capture things like moving people or something that moves at all, even slowly. The long exposures times mean that everyone who is in motion becomes invisible. So you see this image of a street that Daguerre took. in 1839. It is a daguerreotype, but you don't see any people on it. But we know that there were people on the street. It's just that the long exposure time made it so none of the people were actually recorded. However, somebody was standing on the street, standing still. You can see him in the upper left-hand corner of the picture. I'm going to show you a close-up in a moment. But he is thought to be the very first human being ever recorded by camera. There's a close-up. You can see he's just kind of standing there, and you don't get a full vision of exactly what he looks like. He's kind of a blur, a ghostly type figure. But we know that there were likely more people on the street at the time. They just weren't recorded because they were moving. It did mean that daguerreotypes were favored for portraiture. As long as the sitter sat real still, you could get a fairly realistic looking idea or fairly realistic photograph of a person's face. So now the portrait is possible. Within 20 years of Daguerre's inventions, photographers were being photographs were being printed on paper, and things like wars were actually able to be documented through photography. We now have a new ability to capture current events. And all of a sudden, there's a new perspective on the atrocities of war. Documentary photography was more powerful than newsprint engravings that were popular during that time. Artists were still in need, though. Even photographers staged scenes. So they needed design concepts, and they needed to know how art is used to capture a beautiful picture. This particular artist is Timothy O'Sullivan. He would take pictures on the battlefield of the Civil War after the bloodshed was over. So I want you to stop and think a minute. Why after the bloodshed was over? Right? Because the most moving pictures of today are done in mid-action, right? Somebody's in sports photography, someone jumping up to catch the football is way more interesting than somebody standing there after they caught the football. So why after? If you said after because the person was dead and they couldn't move, you're partly right. But there's another reason. It's because the artist can then manipulate the picture. He doesn't have the ability to manipulate the picture in an action shot. What he gets is what he gets. But when you are able to manipulate the picture in a shot that is for, or that's able, that when you're able to manipulate the subject matter by moving the bodies around the field or moving the dead body in a place that creates an aesthetically pleasing view, you then all of a sudden have more artistic control. But you know, the thing about it is that you think at the time that what you're looking at is a record of a real life encounter, but it's not. It's sort of the aftermath, and the artist manipulated it. Because photojournalism had not come into fashion yet, this was still considered to be an artistic form. Here you see a close-up by Timothy O'Sullivan called The Home of the Rebel Sharpshooter Battlefield at Gettysburg in 1863. He was a sharpshooter. You see him, he's laying dead on the battlefield there. The previous slide showed the bunker that he was hiding behind. All right, so we're getting ready to move on to realism. That was spurred by the industrialization of Europe and the United States in about 1850. Here's a map that shows sort of how the industrialization spread. throughout Western Europe, up into Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Took a little bit longer to develop in terms of the Industrial Revolution. I would say full swing Industrial Revolution started in Europe and France. Germany soon followed, Austria and Poland. Okay, so a new style comes about as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The stylistic features of this new style, called realism, are listed here. Painters believe in only representing what's seen with their own eyes. They look at art as being logical, and they have working scenes that show the exploitation of the working class. Some basic background information. Karl Marx and Engels release a critique on capitalism called Marx's Communist Manifesto. That book, along with Baudelaire's poetry, really change or help to record and fuel workers' revolts. The Industrial Revolution brought about a need for mass numbers of people to work. It also brings about a situation where you have two very different socioeconomic classes. You have the people who are working for pennies a day, and then you have the people that own the factories. And so we get workers who are revolting and rocking governments in Europe. And the invention of the camera changes the face of art at this time. It's the first time that art sees photographs. Realism emerges in France as a new movement immediately after the uprisings of 1848. The 1848 revolts throughout Europe were based on a wide gap in income between the working class poor and the growing prosperity of the elite. Each saw the other as a threat. So here's an 1848 rendering from Paris showing some of the barricades that the revolutionaries built. It was spurred by the publication of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto that year, and there were violent clashes in Germany, Italy, Poland, England, and France. A revolutionary government actually runs France for a few months. This is Baudelaire. He is a French poet who writes Les Fleurs du Mal. He's an art critic, and his ideas are essential in fueling the artistic movement of realism. You'll have to forgive my horrible French accent. I took Spanish as a research language, so my French is just not as well pronounced. Baudelaire calls for art celebrating the heroism of modern life. He's the philosophical idea behind realism. In the fine arts, in the visual arts, we have a new leader. His name is Gustave Courbet. He was the unofficial leader of the Realists in 1848. And in 1855, he put on a sensational one-man show in Paris and wrote a manifesto that helped explain realism better. He wanted to paint things that opened the world's eyes to the way that society really lived. He didn't feel that painting mythological scenes or fictitious things that people made up in their heads was relevant. He said, "I have never seen an angel. Show me an angel, and I'll paint one." And so he goes about recording scenes like this of the Stonebreakers. Courbet upsets the conservatives in Paris with two paintings that were in the Salon of 1849. They represented a new interest in working class subject matter, and this is the first one of those two. This is a father and son team. They are nameless, and they are essentially faceless. Courbet shows the work that they're doing over showing us their identity. Why did he not want to show us their identity? Stop and think about that for a moment. We see clues to the lives that the Stonebreakers lead. You see a pot, a soup pot, and a meager lunch off in the right-hand corner behind the old man. You look at the boy's clothes, and you see that they're too small for him. They're ripped and tattered into shreds. The old man also has ripped up clothing. We know that gravel roads were made by breaking up large stones, and that's what their job is, to break up the big stones. You get a sense that a passage of time has happened in this painting, and you get a sense that they've done grueling work, primarily because the clothes are so dingy. So I want to go back to that question I had for you. Why is this painting so shocking? Why is it so riveting? Why was it such a stir in the salon? It has to do with the age of the people, for one. You've got a young boy who should be where? In school. And an older gentleman who should be doing what? What's an old man do every day? He's supposed to be relaxing in his easy chair, right? Smoking a cigar, watching the birds, and enjoying retired life. But instead, he's out breaking up stones so he can pay for his dinner. The Paris Salon felt that this painting was repulsive. It was presented at the salon. Obviously, it did not make it into... Well, I don't know that for sure. It may have made it into the show. But the people who saw the painting were just revolted by it. They were revolted by it because they felt that it brings about an idea of the others. So, in a high French society, they're busy partying. They're busy hanging around, having fun. And they're not people who want to acknowledge that the higher in society employ people to do this type of backbreaking work. Courbet focuses on the work that the two people do intently. His message is that this happens in our town, in our city, under our nose, right in front of our face. Courbet claims that he saw these two people outside of his painting studio, and he painted it. That this was a real-life, everyday scene that just happened to fall in his lap. The other painting that made the major ruffling of feathers was by Courbet as well. It was called The Burial at Ornans from 1849. It simply shows a burial in Courbet's provincial hometown of Ornans in France. No one famous is being buried here. There's no example of virtuous and morality to uncover. Instead, what we see is what a funeral really looks like. There are people in the crowd. They're looking at each other. They're talking. Nobody's all that focused on the person that they're burying, except the people who are actually performing the ceremony of burial. If you look closely, you can see that the men in the painting have bulbous red faces. they show signs of intoxication or at least being lifelong drinkers with their red, blotchy skin and bulbous red noses. The other thing that was interesting about this painting really was that its size was so enormous. I've seen this painting in real life. It's much larger than life size. The people are life size. And so you get this painting that's just huge and very in your face. And I think that was part of Courbet's intention, was to capture attention through its large size. So Francois Millet emerges as the leader of the realism movement after Courbet. He was arguably better suited to paint peasants at work than Courbet was, because Courbet had been raised in a middle class household. He really didn't have much experience with poverty, but Millet grew up on a farm, and he saw the lower class working hard, as well as he himself was not as wealthy as Courbet. This painting is called The Sower. It is by Millet. And we could see it as a painting of a French peasant who is doing the hard labor of sowing seeds on the farm. But Millet was a devout Christian, and his aim here was to paint Christ's parable of the sower from the book of Mark in chapter 4. But Millet's most famous painting deals with an issue that he saw on the farm called gleaning. Gleaning meant to clean up the scattered remains of crops after a wheat harvest. It was something that poor peasants often had to do in Millet's time to survive. There's an interesting documentary that shows this situation continues into the 21st century, with dumpster diving being the modern equivalent. The British artists of the 1850s sort of sanitized the issue in this painting. This is done by Frederick Goodall. And you could see the gleaners here. They've been hard at work gleaning all day, picking up the small pieces of wheat, and they've went to walk home, and they've sat to have a rest. Why does the scene feel sanitized? Because people that have been doing backbreaking work, usually in the middle of the sun, in the afternoon sun, are sunburnt. They have red faces, their clothes are very dirty, and they're all tattered. These figures look more like Hummel figurines and children who have just washed up and gotten ready to go somewhere. Gleaning was really a serious issue. Gleaners were often shot by protective or fearful landowners. They would come along and pick up the pieces of hay after the machines would come and pick up the hay and roll it into barrels. The landowners were fearful that the gleaners might steal their belongings, or that they might rob them for money. Millet took some time in preparing a salon painting that would show the humane gesture of allowing gleaning to happen on a large farm. So it's sort of like, like I said, it's the modern equivalent, or the ancient, not ancient, it's the 1800s equivalent of dumpster diving. But, it's basically like they would come by, and it's not like the farmers were offering to pay them. They would pick up the little pieces of wheat and take it and sell it. Millet includes the background scenes of the workers that are actually employed on the large collective farm. And that's an important dichotomy, right? It's an important juxtaposition. The paid workers versus the unpaid workers who are gathering the leftover bits of harvest so that they can survive. The three figures that glean in the foreground are the main subject of the painting. But you can see that they are accompanied by. So some of you might be wondering what the heck is gleaning anyway. So I pulled a definition from dictionary.com primarily because I had no idea what it was whenever I first saw this painting. Gleaning is a process in which the poor come back in after a commercial harvest has taken place and pick up the leftover vegetables that didn't make it into the harvest. So for these ladies, they're gleaning a wheat crop. However, even in modern times, people go in after a commercial harvest and glean. Gleaning is something that for an everyday family would be profitable. You could get enough vegetables to make a family a meal. And so for some communities, gleaning is something that the poor do to help make ends meet. But generally, it's a process that's used by someone who is poor. Back in the day that Courbet painted, gleaning was something that was considered illegal, and farmers were somewhat fearful of the people that gleaned. They were afraid of being robbed. They were afraid of them taking their things. It's backbreaking work because you're bent, stooped over all day, picking up the leftover vegetables, in this case, the leftover wheat. So here is the full painting, Jean-Francois Millet's The Gleaners. And as beautiful as the painting is today, it was a very provocative gesture when it appeared in the Salon in 1857. It glorified the work of the working class that was starting to make the middle class feel very uneasy. Remember that the middle class is growing in size because of the Industrial Revolution. They can afford more. And so that the aristocracy that's always been super rich and the super poor have always stayed in those two socioeconomic spaces, but then in the middle, that middle class of business owners is becoming much more fruitful and much more rooted. So this is the Horse Fair by Rosa Bonheur. She painted it in 1835 to 1855. Bonheur was female, which made her very unique because she was the only female of the realists. She paints the horse market in Paris, which is on a street that you can see the hospital from where she was painting. The hospital's asylum was near there, which you can see in the left-hand side in the background. Bonheur sketched at the horse fair, or the horse market, twice a week. She would go and study the horses. She'd study the way they moved. She'd study how they looked when they moved. And she went disguised as a male. Why? Well, because a horse auction is absolutely no place for a lady in the 1800s in Paris. She was a well-established animal painter. When this painting debuts in the Paris Salon in 1853, it receives positive reviews and was wide loved and receives lots of praise. When she arrived at the final plan for the painting, she drew inspiration from George Stubbs, Theodore Géricault, who did the Raft of Medusa, which you remember from Romanticism, Delacroix, who was also a Romanticism painter, and Greek sculpture. She referred to the horse fair as her own Parthenon frieze. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has an interesting take on this particular painting. It's quite a beautiful painting. It shows the realism of the way the horses were treated at the horse fair, which was not well, um, and is unique because Bonner is a woman. I would say the most famous of the people that we probably know from the realist movement is Edward Manet. Manet was an individual or an independent maverick. He was a socialite. People would call him a dandy. He was very much taken with portrayal of real life scenes that Courbet painted. And he continues the realist agenda into the 1860s. The spirit of realism also exists among the urban artists of the 1850s and 60s. Manet was born and raised in Paris, and he was the key member of the emerging avant garde of Paris, which sort of means the front guard or the advanced scouts for modernism. He was eager to find subject matter that no one had considered prior to this. Although he's sometimes discussed alongside them, Manet was not an impressionist, technically. He declined their invitation to join them. He was more of an independent artist. This non associated artistic type is found in the development of art, literature, and music in these decades. And we're going to see more and more of that as the modern eras get moving. You will see that it feels as if there are more and more artists that just don't fit into a certain category. Manet, arguably, though, is definitely part of the realist agenda. He was interested in the realist movement, but he was also interested in the classics. He took inspiration from this Renaissance painting that, if you took art history too, you would have seen. It is Giorgione's The Pastoral Concert. It's in the Louvre in Paris, where Manet spent many hours admiring it and did lots of copies of it. Here you can see that he liked this composition from the corner of a lost Raphael that the Louvre had. There are three river gods in Raphael's classic mythology scenes, and neither this scene nor Giorgione's is one that he copied directly. But you can see its influence in the placement of figures. You see the influence of Giorgione's painting in Manet's painting. In Manet's painting, we see two middle class gentlemen that are in the company of nude women and half dressed women in the park. And we don't know why. We'll probably never know why these two men were here in the park with these two nude women. So the model here is unusual because she's short. She's shorter than most of the nude models in Paris at the time. She is doing something different than what most of the painting. Wait a minute. When you compare Giorgione's painting with Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, Manet's picture was criticized by the artistic community. It was said to be crude and harsh, and ultimately felt like he was battling photography as a medium, and that world would soon no longer need an artist. So you've heard me mention the Salon de Refus, and Manet's Luncheon on the Grass made it into the Salon de Refus in 1863. The Salon gives the paintings that were rejects a completely separate room at the Salon, and it wasn't meant to glorify the painting, rather to show a sense of snobbery, as if the paintings that were picked to be shown at the Salon were of high quality and that the rejects are of low quality. There are a couple other paintings that you see here that were also uh, presented at the Salon de Refuse. Um, I'm showing you close-ups of the painting here so that you can see why the painting was refused by the Salon. Not only did Manet air out the French's dirty laundry of the common practice of fraternizing with prostitutes, he also is ultimately battling the art of photography. We see that he paints his models in a flattened state. And if you look here at how you compare the skin on a photograph to the skin that Manet paints, you can see that there's a sense of flatness and that the photograph relies on the outline just as much as Manet's painting does. Photographs rely on the edges of the surfaces touching each other. That juxtaposition of the edge of a surface gives the photograph some drama. And so in the photograph on the right, you can see how her skin compared to the velvet richness of the material that is draped over her top makes the skin feel or seem soft and supple, as well as the velvet in the skin compared to the background of the wall makes the skin seem soft and supple. But without the outline of the skin meeting the background of the wall, you don't get that sense of comparison. And Manet does the same thing here when he paints. You can see that the skin touches fabrics and background information, the grass, and that without that background information there, you don't get the same type of flatness that Manet was really going for. This salon really had just so many paintings that were submitted to it that and the jury went through the paintings very quickly. Like they only had a week to pick the paintings that were going to be accepted. So you might be able to understand why Manet's painting of contemporary clothing optional double dating could be thrown into the rejected or refused pile that week. It's like I said, it was a process that was done very quickly. Whistler also submitted a painting that year, Girl Symphony in White, who was rejected as well. And she wasn't in clothing optional at all. And we think that they rejected Whistler's painting because it was flat looking the way Manet's painting was. It was thought to be crude. In 1881, the French government abandons the salon by handing it over to a private group. And by that point, the French government concedes that they can't make judgments about what is good art versus what is bad art. And so to avoid controversy and problems, they simply quit trying. They decide that the salon is not a place for the French government to be, that they shouldn't be deciding what's good and bad art, and therefore sort of the way that artists compete for selling paintings changes. The Paris Salon, the death of the Paris Salon births the modern art gallery ideas, the ability for the modern art gallery to be a trendsetter and have artists that have unique voices be heard. Manet forges ahead in that same year, and using the same small red-headed model that he used for Luncheon on the Grass, he creates a painting that is a spoof on Titian's Venus of Urbino. It is Manet's Olympia, painted in 1863. When we compare Manet's Olympia to the Venus of Urbino, to Titian's Venus of Urbino, we see that there's almost an equal and opposite answer for each artistic problem that Titian comes up with. By the way, the model's name that sits in this painting is Victorine. We say that she plays a scandalous woman, a modern woman, because she plays the urban prostitute. Titian's painting was demure. It was a wedding gift for a young bride who needed to, or who was being taught what her, responsibilities in a marriage were. But Manet's painting was not at all about demureness. It was more about confrontation from the prostitute, that states that, hey, this girl's working out of her own apartment in Paris. She's self-managed, and she has a maid, which means that she's making a good living at doing what she does. The urban prostitute in Paris often sat for portraits. The only way to get a model at that time was to hire a prostitute. No self-respecting woman would pose nude for an artist that wasn't that was, especially if you were married. Even if you weren't married, it would taint you. It would be sort of like no man would want to marry a woman who an artist had painted a nude painting of. And so in this case, it makes Victorine seem powerful. Unfortunately for women in the 1800s, this was the reality of the situation. They really didn't have a whole lot of choices. It was get married or work as a prostitute or a maid. And so Victorine says, I'm in charge of my own destiny. I will be alone, but I will have enough money to feed myself and put a nice roof over my head. This is a close-up of Manet's Olympia. You can see how directional the gaze is, how very much she is staring directly at the viewer. You can see the heavy outline that Manet relies upon. Another interesting fact about this painting is that, remember I told you that the Salon gave up in 1866. This painting was done by Manet 2 years after Luncheon on the Grass. And Manet submits it to the Salon, and they accept the painting. So 2 years later, they don't want another Salon de Refus, and so they accept the painting. We don't know for sure if that's why they accepted it. We just know that they did. So I would like to compare Titian's Venus of Urbino with you. You can see when we look at Titian's Venus of Urbino versus Olympia, that equal and opposite sort of answer. So Titian's painting has a dog, a sweet dog that stands for fidelity, that sits at the end of the model's feet. In Manet's painting, we get this cat who is startled. The black cat was a more emotional representation. the cat is startled by the viewer's presence. Here you can see a direct comparison of Olympia and Titian's work. You can see where the cat is startled versus where the dog sleeps. In the background of Titian's work, you see a young child putting away the toys of the past with her governess. On the left-hand side, you can see that Manet's Olympia, the maid that Olympia pays, is handing her a bouquet of flowers from a suitor. I want you to keep this handing of bouquet of flowers to the suitor sort of in your back pocket, because I'm going to ask you a question about it for homework. Here you can see Titian's work compared directly to Manet's work in terms of the way he handles the flesh on the body. When you compare Titian to Manet, in an even closer view, you can see that Titian's work brings about this nice, soft, supple turning of the skin. We call that, oh boy, it left me, modeling. And we also call it chiaroscuro. It's an Italian word that means to turn in the light. Manet's work does not turn in the light the same way that Titian's does. You don't get a sense of roundness in the face the way Titian does. Manet relies heavily on that outline, the juxtaposition of where the pillow meets the model's body to define her proportions, as well as to define what her skin looks like. You can really see this when we put the two faces together. Which one do you feel like is more flattering? Titian's or Manet's? Close up again of Victorine's face. And then, of course, I'm bringing you full circle back to the cat and the dog. So I told you that I wanted you to keep the who are the flowers from in your back pocket. This was a political cartoon that was printed in a newspaper. This often happened. If there was a painting that was famous in the salon, or that people were talking about, they would do some sort of spoof on it and print it in a newspaper. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to ask you a question for homework about this painting. It will be your short answer question.